I'm back. It's Red Chair Reading with Hobie 1. We're doing The Ghost at Skeleton Rock by Franklin W. Dixon. I wonder what these hardy boys are doing now. Chapter 16, Island of Danger. Inside the cargo compartment, Frank slowly revived. When he realized the plane was airborne, he was seized with terror. The ship was soaring higher and higher, and the cargo hold was not pressurized. Frank shuddered at the thought of blacking out for an indefinite time through lack of oxygen at high altitudes. Also, there was the danger of freezing to death. At the airport, meanwhile, Joe had managed to locate the night manager, a husky, balding man named Mr. Lopez. Though somewhat doubtful about the boy's story, he promised to alert both the tower and the airport detectives for any sign of a disturbance. Joe returned to the field just in time to see the cargo plane take off. Apparently, there had been no trouble. Frank was nowhere in sight. Joe walked through the waiting room, looking up and down. Suddenly, an alarming thought struck Joe. Was Frank, by any chance, in the plane? Joe hurried back to the manager's office. Hastily, he reported his brother's disappearance. "Please call the plane back, Mr. Lopez," he exclaimed. "I'm sure Frank's locked in the cargo compartment." The man looked puzzled. "Why, you told me yourself your brother had climbed out of the plane and reported everything was all right." "What?" "Look, are you playing a game?" snapped Mr. Lopez. Joe turned pale. "I haven't been back here in your office since I first talked to you." Breathlessly, Joe explained how a man they thought was a smuggler was practically his double. "That faker has already posed as me once," Joe went on. "He did it so he could sabotage our plane before we flew here. Now he's done it again, so they could trap my brother. Mr. Lopez, you must bring that plane back." Though startled by what Joe had told him, Lopez hesitated. "I can't bring back the ship just on your say-so," he protested. "Maybe your brother is still here. I'll have him paged on the loudspeaker." In a moment, the public address system was blaring out Frank's name, asking him to call the manager's office at once. There was no response, but suddenly a startling bit of news was relayed to Lopez. The two detectives assigned to watch the cargo plane had been found unconscious. Mr. Lopez needed no further convincing about Frank's plight. He called the tower, "Radio Flight 348 to return to San Juan immediately. Emergency." Up in the tower, the operator barked the orders into his mic. Then he added, "Attention, all planes, an emergency landing is expected. All other ships in the air, circle the field until further notice. Repeat, circle the field." An ambulance with oxygen equipment was rushed out on the field. Joe found the tension almost unbearable as he waited. At last, the green and red lights of the cargo craft were sighted. A few minutes later, the big plane landed and taxied down the runway. Even before the landing wheels slowed to a halt, the ambulance roared out to meet it. Doctor, stretcher bearers, and ground crew stood ready as the door of the cargo hatch was unlocked. Joe, forced to watch from the apron, saw a still figure being carried out onto the stretcher. "Frank!" Breaking away from the manager and guards, Joe raced out to the field. "Frank! Frank!" he cried frantically. "Take it easy, son," said one of the ground crewmen, restraining him gently. "Doc's doing everything he can." The stretcher was lifted into the ambulance, and Joe jumped in after it. The doctor applied an oxygen mask to Frank. Then he filled a hypodermic and injected a stimulant. Badly shaken, Joe could only watch and hope. After what seemed hours, he saw the color seeping back into his brother's cheeks. Soon Frank became conscious, but appeared dazed. Joe flashed an anxious look at the doctor, who nodded reassuringly. "He's all right now, but it was a mighty close call. Fortunately for him, the plane had not remained at high altitude for too long." A few minutes later, Frank, with a rueful grin, told his story. "I am sure glad that plane was called back," he remarked. Thank you, brother," said the physician. "Now, young man, I want you to rest in our infirmary for an hour." While Frank relaxed on a hospital bed, word came that there had been no theft of freight from the plane, but the two cargo handlers had admitted accepting money from some man to leave the cargo door open. "I have a hunch you foiled a robbery," Joe told Frank. "That shipment of parts for an atomic weapon will reach its destination now." "I hope so, but we didn't capture any of the gang. What's more, they'll probably make it tougher than ever for us." Joe nodded in agreement. When the doctor discharged Frank, the boys started back to their hotel. "I sure hope Chet and Tony are there," said Joe. To their relief, the Hardys found that their two friends had just returned. They were sweaty and disheveled. Tony had a cut on his forehead, and Chet was hobbling on one leg. "It looks as if you'd run into trouble," Joe remarked in alarm. "Real trouble," Chet confessed. He said that after an hour of cruising, he and Tony had spotted the suspicious blue speedboat and given chase. Suddenly, though, the blue craft was outrunning their own. It had turned around and deliberately sideswiped Tony's boat. As they went by, Tony took up the story. The men in the boat hid their faces. You mean you didn't get a good look at them?" Joe asked. "Not a peek," Tony replied. "And boy, did they really let us have it. The collision had stove in the side of Tony's boat and disabled the propeller. Both Chet and Tony had been hurled from their seats and almost swept overboard by the speedboat's powerful wake. We managed to signal the harbor police by waving our shirts," Chet said. "They towed us into shore, then went to hunt for the blue boat." "Any luck?" Frank asked. "Not a bit," Chet replied. "We hung around the dock waiting for word till it got dark, but the police couldn't find any trace of the blue speedboat." "I'll bet I know why," Joe said grimly. "Instead of coming back to port, those men made for an island offshore. That's probably the reason they smashed up Tony's boat, so you couldn't find out which way they were heading." For the first time, the four friends grinned, and Frank said, "But they didn't fool us. Tomorrow we'll get another boat and head north of Cabezona. And now," said Tony, "tell Chet and me what you fellas have been doing." When they heard the Hardys' story, their grins faded, and Chet said woefully, "All I wanted was a ventriloquist dummy, and look what happened." After another hour of conversation, the four boys went to bed. The next morning, they felt none the worse for their previous day's experiences. After a hearty breakfast of bacon and eggs, they took a taxi to the boat dock. "Wonder how much that man'll charge for us for damages," Tony said uncomfortably. The boat owner, however, was quite cordial. "Do not worry, senores," he assured the boys. "The police have told me the whole story, and I know it was not your fault. Besides, the boat was covered by insurance." This time, Frank rented a much faster speedboat and filled the tank with enough fuel for a long run. Heading westward, they cruised along the Puerto Rican coast until Frank sighted a pineapple-shaped hill at the tip of a small pit of land. "There's Punta Cabezona," he told Tony. "Now steer a course due north." As they headed out to sea, the water was almost glassy calm. About 20 miles out, they sighted a small island, green and palm-fringed. Joe gave a whoop of triumph. "Frank, I believe your hunch about a hideout north of Cabezona is paying off. Where to now?" Tony asked. "Do we make a landing?" "That's what we came for," Frank said grimly as he shaded his eyes to peer shoreward. The tiny island was narrow and string-bean shaped, with its long axis lying north and south. Tony cruised cautiously until he found an opening in the coral reef surrounding the islet. Then he steered toward the beach through the gentle breakers and anchored in shallow water. The boys kicked off their sneakers and waded ashore. "I wonder if any of the gang is lurking around," Joe murmured when they reached the sandy beach, which sparkled bone-white in the sunshine. "Maybe we should have—" He broke off, startled, as a horde of wild-eyed natives sprang from a dense thicket of greenery. Waving clubs and knives, they charged at the boys, with blood-chilling yells. "Run for it!" yelled Frank. The boys plunged into the water and plowed back to the boat. As Chet, in the rear, squirmed aboard, Frank gunned the engines and steered out to a safe distance. Back near shore, the natives stood waist-deep in water, still yelling and shaking their weapons. "Wow," Joe gulped. "What started all that?" We did," said Chet, trembling with fright. "We must have landed right in the middle of the gang's hideout. Those cannibals are standing guard for him." "Cannibals nothing," said Tony. "I'll bet those are Carib Indians." "Isn't that what they call the original inhabitants of these parts?" "Call them anything you like," Chet replied. "They're still heap bad medicine." The stout boy was all for returning to San Juan, but the other three managed to persuade him that they should explore further. With Frank at the helm, they cruised along the western shore of the island. Presently they came to a small cove, which formed a snug little natural harbor. Alongside a pier which jutted out into the water, a red motorboat was moored. Back of the shore lay a palatial white villa. Must be some millionaire's vacation home, Chet remarked, but I wouldn't want to be that close to those natives. On higher ground, back at the estate, the boys glimpsed an airstrip with a plane on it, much like the Hardys' craft, except that it was silver in color. Should we tie up and look around? Chet asked. Not yet, said Frank. Let's cruise a bit farther first and get the lay of the land. Continuing along the coast, they circled the northern tip of the island. It was covered with pineapple fields, but there was no sign of workers or natives. Guess we may as well go back, Frank remarked. He reversed course and steered back around the island. As they neared the tiny harbor, a man waved cheerfully from the pier. Hi there, he shouted. Come on in. Frank brought the boat to shore, and they tied up to the dock on the opposite side of the red motorboat. The man who had called to them was a stout and affable-appearing person, wearing an immaculate white suit and puffing on a cigar. Glad to see you, he greeted the boys as they climbed onto the pier. We don't often have visitors. Durling Hamilton's my name, he added. The boys shook hands and introduced themselves. They learned that Hamilton was a retired sportsman who spent most of his time on the island estate. What brings you boys out here? He queried. We're hunting for a gang of thieves, Chet blurted before Frank or Joe could stop him. Hamilton appeared not to notice the awkward silence that followed. Well, I wish you luck, he smiled. Got quite a problem myself. Confounded natives just south of here have made trouble for me ever since I built my home on Calypso Island. The Hardys and their friends tried not to look startled at this remark. Casually, Frank asked, Did you say Calypso Island? Hamilton nodded. That's what the natives call it. They're descendants of Carib Indians with some mixed blood. They practice voodoo, and worship a small flat stone, Skeleton Rock. That is the end of chapter 16. We have 4 more chapters to go, which I will read on Friday. So probably sometime late Friday, we'll get some more chapters up and finish the book. And in the meantime, why don't you click over there for the the next chapter, or whatever the next video is that comes up for you until I do the next chapter, and click that button there to subscribe. All right, catch you later. Bye. Clicky, clicky.